Welcome, everyone. This is Watch Night, Freedom and Empowerment Readings. Just want to wish everyone a wonderful Watch Night and a Happy New Year to you in 2024. For those watching live and for those on the replay, I wish you nothing but success and prosperity in 2024. Tomorrow, we're going to be going over with my esteemed colleagues the reparations recap for 2023. That's going to be January 1st at 10 a.m. 2024. Once again, that's reparations recap. 2023 reparations recap. It's Monday, January 1st, 2024 at 10 a.m. right here on Amend the Mass Media Group. So the books that we're going to be reading from today are going to be Dirty Little Secrets by the great Dr. Claude Anderson, American Negro Slave Revolts by Herbert Aptheker, African People and European Holidays and Mental Genocide by Ishaka Musa Barashengo. Book 2, he also has a book 1, which is a great volume as well. Highly recommend reading both of those along with the other books we're going to read tonight from My Face is Black is True, Callie House and the Struggle for Ex-Slave Reparations by Mary Frances Berry, as well as Susan Jeffers, Dr. Susan Jeffers, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. Dynamic Techniques for Turning Fear, Indecision, and Anger into Power, Action, and Love. So let's start off with Dirty Little Secrets about Black history, its heroes, and other troublemakers. All right, so I'm going to put up this wonderful video clip loop here. See if you want to watch something visually, but obviously we're going to be reading. Once again, we're going to be reading from Dirty Little Secrets by Dr. Claude Anderson. We're going to start on page 81 in chapter 6 called Colonizing and Colorizing. I'm just going to turn my volume just a tad bit down. It seems a little too loud on my end, so I'm just going to turn it down just a tad bit. All right. So one of the, sections in this chapter 6 starts off with, quote, too many slaves, end quote, starts Revolutionary War. Too much of anything can be bad. During the early exploration of North America, slave trading companies across Europe encouraged immigration to America, promising free land and slave labor. Millions of white Europeans departed their native land in search of the promised riches in a new land. But black slaves shipped into North America outnumbered European whites 6-1. By 1750, in the colonial America, the black slave population peaked at nearly 35%. Fearing that blacks and Indians might ally and subdue the colonists, the Continental Congress pushed England to desist in shipping any more slaves into the colonies. On October 20th, 1774, the Continental Congress drafted the following resolution to end the slave trade. Quote, we will neither import nor purchase any slave imported after the first day of December next, after which time we will wholly discontinue the slave trade, and we will neither be concerned in it ourselves, nor will we hire our vessels, nor sell our commodities or manufacture to those who are concerned in it, end quote. The Continental Congress resolution was a powerful statement, but it meant very little and fell on deaf ears in England as well as with plantation owners because of the massive amount of money involved. The colonies desperately needed slave-produced products and wealth if they were going to attract additional immigrants and build a nation. The colonies had a dilemma. They needed blacks' labor to survive and prosper. They feared the possibility of an Indian and black slave alliance that could seize control of the nation. The colonists wanted a manageable black slave, quote, minority, end quote. As white fears continued to intensify, Thomas Jefferson proposed an immediate ban on slavery, but no later than the year 1800. The proposal, also called the Declaration of Independence in its original form, contained a scathing denunciation of slavery, but the delegates representing South Carolina, Georgia, some slave trading New England states, and other slave interests deleted the language barring slavery and again defeated the resolution. Later, when the U.S. Constitution was written, it codified black enslavement and postponed outlawing international slave trading into the year 1807. The next section reads, Liberty Bell rang first for blacks. Once again, this is the Dirty Little Secrets that we're reading from. All right, let's continue. Liberty Bell rang first for blacks. When the bell was first rung for liberty, it was for the liberty of blacks, not whites. Throughout this nation's history, in the praise of liberty, hoaxes and frauds have abounded and have been told to millions of children and adults alike. According to Richard Schenkman, the ringing of the, quote, Liberty Bell, end quote, to declare this nation's independence on July 4, 1776, began with George Lippard, a Philadelphia journalist. Lippard fabricated the ringing of the Liberty Bell on the 4th of July in a book, The Legends of the American Revolution, that he published in 1847. The only thing true about his story was that the bell did hang in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania State House in 1776 when the founding fathers drafted the Declaration of Independence. But no one rang it for the singing, nor did Americans care much about the bell later. In 1828, the city of Philadelphia tried to sell the bell for scrap, but no one made an offer. The bell simply was not worth the expense of removing it from the building. The bell contains the inscription, quote, proclaim liberty throughout all the land until the inhabitants thereof, end quote. But the inscription cast when the bell was produced in 1753 had nothing to do with the American Revolution. It was not called the Liberty Bell until long after the Revolution and not in honor of the Revolution. The first time anyone referred to the bell as the Liberty Bell, quote, end quote, was in a pamphlet entitled The Liberty Bell by Friends of Freedom, distributed at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Fair in 1839. In the pamphlet, the bell symbolized the freedom of black slaves, not the independence of white Americans from Britain. The name Liberty Bell was coined in 1839 by anti-slavery activists. Okay, I'll read probably for about 2 more sections here, and then we'll get into the next book. Yeah, 2 more sections. This section is titled Colonial Graveyard for Slaves Discovered. On the southern tip of Manhattan, workers discovered Negro burial grounds, a cemetery dating to colonial times, while excavating a site for a new office tower. The cemetery contained the remains of at least 400 slaves and white paupers. Archaeologists suggested that it was the most significant U.S. archaeological discovery of the century. It was the only pre-revolutionary black cemetery known in the United States. Analysis of the remains of children indicated that possibly 50% of New York's slave population died at birth or within the first years of life. Bone analysis indicated that many of the rest were worked to death at a very early age. All right, the next section is titled Slavery Gave Birth to Capitalism. The international commercialization of black slavery changed the world and its economic concepts. The old European mercantilism was replaced by capitalism. Mercantilism meant profiting from the sale of a product. Capitalism means profiting from another's labor. The word, quote, factory, end quote, was first introduced in the 15th century to describe Portuguese buildings that were used as holding places for slaves at points along the West African coast. The, quote, franchising concept, end quote, as popularly known as introduced by the English Royal African Company in 1668 to establish a monopoly on the slave trading industry. Like modern-day franchising chains, for a 15% fee, the Royal African Company provided its franchise slave plantation owners with land, supplies, slaves, military protection, and a ready market for their raw, slave-produced cash products. By the early 1800s, with a renewed interest in cotton production, plantations that had at least 100 slaves introduced a gang system of work. In the gang system, slaves were assigned work using an assembly line type process that revolutionized the use of slave labor, introduced mass production, and significantly increased productivity. Raw materials produced by slaves fueled both Europe's and Americans' industrial and banking revolutions. All right, so another couple of chapters. One's titled Tax Without Rights. That's on page 84. And another one is Nation's First Anti-Smoking Campaign, which is also on 84. But let me read this one section here, and then we'll continue with the next book. This is on page 85 on chapter 6, titled Colonizing and Colorizing. And once again, this is from Dirty Little Secrets. Put the title of the book here, Dirty Little Secrets About Black History, Its Heroes, and Other Troublemakers by Dr. Claude Anderson. All right. Let's continue. On page 85, the section reads, The Founding Fathers founded what? Question mark. The Founding Fathers wrote the principles of white rule into the U.S. Constitution. We, the people of the United States, meant we, the free white people, and the free white people only. The Constitution guaranteed rights and freedoms for everyone but blacks. The black man could not assimilate. He was permanently nailed to the lowest rung of the social ladder. Neither freedom nor good work could force whites to recognize him as an equal human being. During the Revolutionary War, at least 17 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, or 31% of all of his nation's founding fathers, were slaveholders. Collectively, they owned more than 1,400 slaves. George Mason, James Rutledge, and George Washington were the three of the largest slaveholders in the country at the time of the Constitutional Convention. In descending order, the slaveholders and the number of slaves they each owned were: G. Mason of Virginia owned 300 plus, J. Rutledge owned 243, George Washington of Virginia 216, P. Butler of South Carolina 143, C. Pinckney, South Carolina 111, R. Spat, North Carolina 71, C. C. Pinckney of South Carolina 70, D. Carroll of Maryland 53, G. Reed of Delaware 9. It looks like it continues. A. Martin of North Carolina 47, W. Dave, North Carolina 36, W. Blunt, North Carolina 30, D. Jennifer, Maryland 20, E. Randolph, Virginia 16, J. Blair, Virginia 15, J. Madison of Virginia 10, and L. Martin of Maryland 10. There were only limited discussion of the slavery issue among the attendees of the convention. They were vested in the institution of slavery, and there is little doubt that they fully intended to exclude black people from the rights that they would guarantee for themselves and other whites in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. All of the framers of the Constitution were wealthy members of the upper class of American society, but they wanted to please poor whites and assure them that they would always be above blacks, regardless of their income and wealth. By assuring them that they would never have to compete with blacks, The white wealthy class bought themselves an insurance policy forever against the formation of a poor, white, and black coalition. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Once again, that was Dirty Little Secrets. All right. So next book we're going to be reading is American Negro Slave Revolts by Herbert Aptheker. We're actually going to start with the introduction, the section. We're just going to read a couple of pages from that one. And then we'll continue on with our next book. Try to get us out here in a relatively time. Thank you once again for those who are on the live and for those who are listening on the replay. Greatly appreciate you. And maybe by the time you actually listen to this, happy 2024 and happy watch night in tradition of our ancestors. Hopefully they're listening and watching and keeping a close eye on all of us as we transition into 2024. All right, so let's go into the introduction of American Negro Slave Revolts. Here we go. Chapter 1, Introduction. In preparing several years ago a detailed study of the slave rebellion of 1831 in Virginia under the leadership of Nat Turner, the present writer came to the conclusion that this event was not an isolated, unique phenomenon, but the culmination of a series of slave conspiracies and revolts which had occurred in the immediate past. These incidents had largely gone unreported and apparently uninvestigated. The result naturally began a poor focusing of the Turner Rebellion, an incomplete understanding of the events and trends which that outbreak evoked or accelerated. All right, I'm gonna quickly pause there, family. I actually have to go do something real quick. I appreciate y'all's patience. This shouldn't be too long as we're bumping to this music. I just have to keep a pause there, and then I will continue. Let's see, I'm just gonna save this. Okay, I just had to save something real quick. All right, appreciate you. Okay. All right, so once again, this is reading from American Negro Slave Revolts by Herbert Aptheker, the 50th anniversary edition, by the way. All right. Let's continue with the chapter 1 introduction, second paragraph. It seemed probable, furthermore, that a similar situation might exist in respect of the other outstanding instructions and plots, such as those of Cato in 1739, Gabriel in 1800, and Vesey in 1822. That other unknown or practically unknown major outbreaks might have taken place, and that an intensive study of the entire subject might uncover hitherto neglected aspects of life of the Negro people and the role of the institution of slavery in the history of the United States. There has been, and there still is, a notable lack of agreement, both in contemporary and secondary accounts, concerning the details of the subject and its relative importance. Many commentators declare that they observe a considerable degree of contentedness and docility among the Negro slaves, not a few ascribing the latter characteristic to alleged inherent, quote, racial, end quote, qualities, while some, especially contemporaries, assert that they see a notable absence of both. A few examples may be offered. Some regional historians, while implying that discontent and disaffection may have been common elsewhere, affirm that in the locality of their particular interest, these conditions were rare or non-existent. Others, dealing with a brief period of time, declare that signs of unrest are lacking therein, but they often admit that this may not be true or true for other eras. Many eminent historians discussing more general subjects have assumed a similar position on this particular question, a few expressing very strong opinions. Thus, John Fiske thought that the rarity of manifestations of slave unrest was, quote, one of the remarkable facts in American history, end quote. James Schouler, reaching a similar conclusion, based it upon, quote, the innate patience, docility, and childlike simplicity of the Negro, end quote, who he felt was, end quote, an imitator and non-moralist, end quote, learning deceit and libertinism with facility, being easily intimidated, incapable of deep plots. In short, Negroes were a, quote, a black servile race, sensuous, stupid, brutish, obedient to the whip, children in imagination, end quote. Not a few specialists in the field of American slavery have published similar sentiments. One who has referred to a few of the uprisings decided that the fact of their revelation was of greater importance than their existence, and concluded that there was not discontent, but rather, quote, a fine devotion on the part of the majority of the slaves. Let me quote that again. And concluded that there was not discontent, but rather, quote, a fine devotion on the part of the majority of the slaves, end quote. Another, the late Ulrich B. Phillips, who is generally considered the outstanding authority on the institution of American Negro slavery, expressed it as his opinion that, quote, slave revolts and plots very seldom occurred in the United States, end quote. The conclusion coincided with, indeed, was necessary for the maintenance of Professor Phillips' racialistic notions that led him to describe the Negro as suffering from, quote, inherited ineptitude and as being stupid, negligent, docile, inconsistent, dilatory, and biracial quality submissive. And the quote, biracial quality submissive was in quotes. The paragraph continues. By no means all commentators, however, had accepted this viewpoint. Several first-hand observers of the slaves were struck by their restlessness, discontent, and rebelliousness. Thus, for the example, the preamble to a Virginia law of 1669, which made the killing of slaves by owner or overseer as a result of, quote, correction, a non-criminal act, declared that this measure was needed because the only law in force for the punishment of refractory servants resisting their master, mistress, or overseer, lengthening the term of servitude, cannot be inflicted upon Negroes, nor the obstinacy of many of them by other than violent means suppressed, end quote. The same idea was implicit in some of the earliest protests of certain Quakers against slavery. Both the famous Germantown protest of 1688 and the argument presented to the Concord, Pennsylvania monthly meeting 10 years later by Robert Pyle made a point of the belligerent spirit of the Negroes as an argument against slavery, since it proved the suffering of the victims and necessitated armed might for purposes of suppression. All right, I'm just going to read a few more paragraphs and then we'll get to the next book. Governor Drysdale, in his message to the General Assembly of Virginia in 1723, immediately following the crushing of a slave conspiracy, urged the enactment of further precautionary measures with the remark, quote, I am persuaded you are too well acquainted with the cruel dispositions of these creatures, when they have it in their power to destroy or distress, to let slip this fair opportunity of making more proper laws against them, end quote. A leading inhabitant of the same colony, Colonel William Byrd, in a letter to Lord Egmont dated July 12, 1736, appealed for an end to the slave trade on the grounds of the acute danger arising from the increasing number of slaves, for he said, quote, Numbers make them insolent, and then foul means must do what fair will not. But these base tempers require to be rid with a tort rein, or they will be apt to throw their rider. End quote. The Negro leaders Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, may they rest in power, in a pamphlet published in 1794, also referred to the dreadful insurrections that have been made when opportunity offered, and felt that these were sufficient to convince a reasonable man that great uneasiness and not contentment is the inhabitant of their breasts. Occasionally, white Southerners, even in the 19th century, but prior to the flowering of the abolitionist movement, published similar sentiments. Thus, Hugh McCall, one of the earliest historians of Georgia, remarked that, quote, the Negroes could not be supposed to be content in slavery, and would grasp with avidity at the most desperate attempts which promised freedom, end quote. Again, a South Carolina publicist, writing just after the Vesey conspiracy, while maintaining that the slaves were well off, nevertheless admitted, quote, we regard our Negroes as the Jacobins of the country, against whom we should always be upon our guard, and who, although we fear no permanent effects from any insurrectionary movements on their part, should be watched with an eye of steady and unremitting observation, end quote. All right, so let's see here. Okay, I guess I'll just read one more, and then I'll just read one more paragraph, and then we'll go to the next book. Among anti-slavery leaders, there were some who were aware of part of the rebellious record of the slaves. Although even in this group, there were others who believed that docility was characteristic. Of the former may be mentioned Joshua Coffin, Horace Greeley, and John Brown, while among the latter were Richard Hildreth and for a time Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Although American historians have generally tended to minimize or deny the discontent among the Negro slaves of the United States, it is nevertheless true that from time to time recognition of its existence has appeared. Certain Negro scholars, for example, have demonstrated an awareness of the phenomenon, and a few white investigators of the question have also denied that meekness or docility was characteristic of the slaves. Within very recent years, there has been a notable increase in the number of adopting this viewpoint. All right, so we're going to stop there. Actually, it almost ends with the introduction, but I'm going to, and then it goes into chapter, let's see, once again, we're reading from the book American Negro Slave Revolts. The next chapter is The Fear of Rebellion. This is an excellent read too. All these, I believe, can be found on Amazon, so if you like what you're hearing so far, I do suggest you pick up a copy. There might be some PDF copies somewhere. I don't know. If not, you might get a Kindle or something like that. But we're going to continue on to our next book from Ishaka Musa Barashengo, book 2. Once again, he does have a volume 1. This is titled African People and European Holidays, a Mental Genocide. And I'm going to be reading from, let me see what chapter this is. This is chapter 12 on page 115. The section is called The State of the Race During the American Revolution. Let's go. Quote, Patrick Henry declared that while he would not and could not justify slavery, He found Negroes a necessity. Quote, I am drawn along, he said, by the general inconvenience of living without them. In his address to the Virginia Convention, June 24th, 1788, he deplored the necessity of holding his fellow men in bondage, but that their manumission is incompatible with the facilities of the country. Thomas Jefferson and other slaveholders said much the same. End quote. The author goes on to say, the American Revolution is in essence white folks' history, not ours. We just happen to be there. In most cases, as a result of our captivity and enslavement, and in some cases, as the saying goes in Hollywood, we were considered to be extras. In the supporting cast, if you had asked most of the thinking black people in the colonies during the American Revolution and the War of 1812, they would have told you that these events meant nothing for them, save another opportunity to take advantage of the confusion which tends to accompany warfare, by making a strike for their own freedom. Surely nothing concerning the landmarks of American history held anything for the black slave to celebrate except his struggle for independence. In 1775, a grand plot conspired by the African and the Indian cast off their overlords was discovered in the New York colonies. Unnerved by this, local officials gave the order to shoot on sight any black man or red man out after dark, and the possession of firearms by the same was to be punished with no less than the death penalty. At this time, many slaves ran away and joined the Indians. Others offered their services to the British, who supplied them with arms. These slaves harassed their masters, slaughtered them and their families, and conducted their armed attacks on their former masters with such efficiency, the exasperated American colonists accused the British of starting, quote, a race war, end quote. The British had promised the black man his freedom. Consequently, many Africans fought on the side of the redcoats and won many battles for them. During the 18th century, enslavement of black people was a deeply and firmly rooted institutional way of life in the American colonies. All right, once again, this is a section, The State of the Race During the American Revolution, on page 115, chapter titled The American Revolution, A Sham, chapter 12. My bad if I didn't read that, but that's what the chapter, the title is. All right, let's see. Where was I? Okay. During the 18th century, enslavement of black people was a deeply and firmly rooted institutional way of life in the American colonies, particularly in the South. And though in some instances the emotional bond between the slave and his master was often very strong, yet in the case of the thinking slave, this was not sufficient. For when the black slave began to realize his own self-worth and to understand that he was sent to planet Earth to serve God's will and not to be the servant of another or to be used like a good dog or horse or cow, he then set out to rebel against his slave master, and this he did often during the course of the American Revolutionary War. Brother Malcolm once reminded us that though some black people think they came here on the Mayflower, we were in actuality brought to the shores as livestock and sold on the slave market like a horse or a cow or a chicken. In fact, white folks were passing black people around as if they were old clothes. On occasion, General Braddock, after he had been fatally wounded in a fight, bequeathed his bodyguard, a black slave named Bishop, to George Washington as a gift. All right, I'm going to read one more chapter here. This is getting really good, but actually I got to go on to two more books because I know 20 minutes is coming up, and on the West Coast, it's midnight. So I really appreciate everybody for showing up. and getting this information. But yeah, for those who are actually on the East Coast or wherever you're at listening, I'm sure you're already in your New Year's, quote unquote, New Year's time. So wherever you're at, I appreciate you. Thank you. All right, so read one more paragraph and then we'll go to the next book. Though there were some free black men like Paul Cuffe, shout out to the ancestor, from 1759 to 1817, who became a rich philanthropist and did much for the upgrading of the race, and those few token blacks such as Benjamin Banneker, shout out to the ancestor, 1731 to 1806, an astronomer, mathematician, surveyor, builder, and virtual genius who laid out the plans for the District of Columbia. That is why conscious Africans refer to this metropolis as Banneker City. There was still the general misuse and abuse of black skilled labor and talent by the slave masters who held the legal title to their persons. The slave owner would hire out the skilled and artistic crafts of the slave and receive wages of same unto his own pocket. This same principle applies on the job market in America today. Black people are still being, quote, hired out, end quote. The employer makes big profits, and a small fraction of this is your salary. I have even witnessed on one occasion in a white suburban neighborhood in Richard Allen City, Philadelphia, one white woman talking over her backyard fence to another and saying, quote, do you want this girl tomorrow or would you rather I keep her until next week, end quote, in reference to a fully grown black woman who was standing silently nearby. That is why it is so necessary for us as a people to create our own economic and commercial institutions so that we may fairly employ as many of our people as possible. This was the program presented to the use by the Honorable Marcus Garvey, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and many other great teachers who has been raised in our midst. All right, I'm going to stop it there. Once again, that was from the book, African People and European Holidays, a Mental Genocide. And now we're going to go to the great Callie House. My Face is Black is True, by Mary Frances Berry. We're going to start on chapter 5, page 122. The chapter is called The Movement Fights Back. Okay, here we go. The movement fights back. There's a quote, I believe it's a quote maybe from Callie House in 1899. It says, my face is black is true, but it's not my fault. But I love my name and my honesty in dealing with my fellow man. Callie House, 1899. Callie House had a major problem after the post office department denied the association the use of the mails. That's referring to the ex-slave pension association. The pension movement workers were left with Wells Fargo, Adams, or American Express to distribute materials. However, having to use commercial delivery services and to travel more often to keep in touch took time and the association's scarce resources. Mrs. House needed to provide the inspiration that would keep agents organizing and collecting petitions in local chapters, providing mutual assistance to their members. She had to do this in the wake of ongoing federal harassment and avoid permitting the harassment from being a major distraction from the association's real work. Mrs. House remained optimistic and the work continued so successfully that soon their press critics complained that the association had branches, quote, in almost every little hamlet and village throughout the South, end quote. When Mrs. House received the September 1899 notice of the fraud order from Barrett, she had no idea how committed the federal officials were to stopping her and the movement. Responding as if she had citizenship rights the federal government was required to respect, Mrs. House made no apologies for her work. She provided a detailed explanation of the movement's mission and actions. This, she thought, would allay Barrett's concerns. She explained, quote, "First, we are organizing ourselves together as a race of people who feels that they have been wronged," end quote. She rejected his charge that they had misled members. On the contrary, "We tell them we don't know whether they will ever get anything or not, but there is something due them, and if they are willing to risk their money in defraying the expenses of getting up the petition to Congress, they are at liberty to do so." Her explanation, in keeping with her education in civics in Rutherford County's primary schools, insisted that the Constitution of the United States grants to citizens the privilege of peaceably assembling themselves together and petition their grievance. Objecting to the government's disrespect of the movement, she continued that African Americans had a perfect right as ex-slaves to gather and organize ourselves and elect men and women to organize our race together to petition the government for a compensation to alleviate our old, decrepit men and women who are bent up with rheumatism from the exposure they underwent in the dark days of slavery. Furthermore, Callie House told Barrett, "Common horse sense will teach anybody that the officers of this organization are powerless to get a pension from the government for each ex-slave for 25 cents whenever there is no law on the statute books to pension them." All right, I'm going to read a couple more paragraphs and then we're probably going to wrap it up. It's almost 10 minutes, 12 Pacific Standard. All right, proudly she told him, "My whole soul and body are for this slave movement and am willing to sacrifice for it." I'm going to repeat that again. Proudly she told him, "My whole soul and body are for this slave movement and am willing to sacrifice for it." Callie House's forceful and coherent response to Barrett angered federal officials. They also began to understand that she was the de facto head of the association. From that day on, intent on breaking the ex-slave movement, postal officials focused on throttling her to silence. Nashville Postmaster A. Wills explained to Acting Assistant Attorney General Barrett, quote, "She is defiant in her actions and seems to think that the Negroes have the right to do what they please in this country," end quote. After the post office issued the fraud order on October 2nd, 1899, Postmaster Willis told headquarters that she had delivered the letters to Reverend H. Smith, the National Secretary in Brantford, Tennessee, in addition to Callie House in New Orleans, through that city's postmaster. He also quickly disseminated it to newspapers all over the South, asking that they publish it immediately. He stopped 22 money orders amounting in total to $53.84 to the association and had then returned to the senders. House and the association continued to organize while attending to the federal surveillance. She traveled more than ever, lecturing to both white and colored people on this movement. This was a distinct hardship. Her brother and his wife, who lived next door, helped to care for her children. The oldest, Thomas, was 15 and the youngest, Annie, was 6. Mrs. House had worked all of her life, but as a washerwoman and seamstress. This was the work that most black women with children did. But widowed and now working outside the home, Mrs. House had departed from the usual role. All right, we'll go ahead and pause there. Once again, that was from the chapter, "The Movement Fights Back." from the book My Face is Black is True. Callie House and the Struggle for Ex-Slave Reparations. All right. So I want to read a couple of quick chapters, or not chapters, I should say. I guess sentences, paragraphs. Yeah, sentences, paragraphs. This is from the book Susan Jeffers, Dr. Susan Jeffers, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. Dynamic techniques for turning fear, indecision, and anger into power, action, and love. All right. Let's see, what is this chapter? This is chapter 2, titled Can't You Make It Go Away? Question mark. Starts on page 14. And this section is called Truth 1. I'm going to read Truth 1 and Truth 2. There are a couple of truths in here, but I just want to start with Truth 1 and Truth 2, and we'll end it there. And then I guess we'll see y'all hopefully tomorrow, Sunday, New Year's. All right, here we go. Truth 1. Not hopefully, we will. See you tomorrow. All right. Let's continue. Truth 1. Truth 1. The fear will never go away as long as I continue to grow. As long as I continue to push out into the world, as long as I continue to stretch my capabilities, as long as I continue to take new risks in making my dreams come true, I was going to experience fear. What a revelation. Like Morgan and so many of you reading this book, I had grown up waiting for the fear to go away before I took any chances. When I am no longer afraid, then, for most of my life, I had played the win/then game, and it never worked. Once again, you are probably not jumping up and down with joy. I'm aware that this revelation is not exactly one you wanted to hear. If you are like the students in my classes, you were hoping that my words of wisdom would miraculously make your fears go away. I'm sorry to say it does not work that way. On the other hand, rather than thinking of it as a disappointment, consider it a relief that you no longer have to work so hard on getting rid of that fear, or the fear. It isn't going to go away, not to worry. As you build confidence in yourself with the exercises suggested herein, your relationship with fear will dramatically alter. Not long after discovering Truth 1, I made another important discovery that contributed enormously to my growth. Truth 2. The only way to get rid of fear of doing something is to go out and do it. This sounds contradictory to Truth 1, yet it isn't. Fear of a particular situation dissolved when I finally confronted them. The doing it comes before the fear goes away. I can illustrate this by recounting my first teaching experience when I was studying for my doctorate. I was not much older than my students, and I was teaching a subject in which I had dubious expertise, the psychology of aging. I anticipated the first class period with a tremendous sense of dread. During the 3 days prior to the class, my stomach felt like it was on a roller coaster. I had prepared 8 hours of work for a 1-hour class. I had handwritten enough material for 3 lectures. None of this took away my fear. When the first day of class finally arrived, I felt like I was being sent to the guillotine. As I stood in front of my students, I could feel my heart pounding and my knees shaking. Somehow I got through the class period, but I was not ecstatically looking forward to the second one the following week. Thankfully, things were easier the next time. If not, I might have left teaching permanently. I started to become familiar with the faces in the classroom and connected some of the names to the faces. The third class was better than the second. As I started to relax and go with the flow of the students, by our 6th session, I was actually looking forward to standing in front of my class. The interaction with my students was stimulating and challenging. One day, as I was approaching that once dreaded classroom, I realized I was no longer afraid. My fear had turned into sweet anticipation. All right, family. Speaking of anticipation, I'm anticipating those who are watching the live stream and those who are listening to the live stream. I don't know. I think we put this on Twitter too. We're also on here on YouTube. Tomorrow we're going to have a reparations recap. This is going to be great informational, great build with my esteemed colleagues here on the Mass Media Group. A lot of stuff was happening in the nation on reparations, and a lot of stuff was not happening in reparations, especially when it comes to lineage-based reparations. So we're going to have a good time tomorrow. Join us, please, right here on the Mass Media Group. That is going to be Monday, tomorrow, January 1st, 2024. Family, I so love you. I so appreciate you. We are going to continue this mission. We are going to be victorious, and we are going to get these reparations for our ancestors and for us and for the future freedmen, future FBA, future ADOS, however acronym you call yourself. Peace to you. Peace to your family. Much love. And please keep dedicated. Definitely. Shout out, bro. Appreciate you, man. Just what it is. Keeping it pushing, family. That's right. That's how we do. So, yes, please show up tomorrow, Monday, the 1st, 2024 at 10 a.m. And if you can't show up, definitely watch it, because there might be something going on in your neck of the woods that you need to be aware of and that you need to start advocating for, because there's a lot of stuff out there that's just crazy going on, and we're just like, they are doing what? So anyway, that's from the West Coast to the North to the South and to the East. There's some interesting stuff going on there. Definitely like your opinion. So thanks once again. As always, appreciate you. And on that note, family, take care of your family. This is Watch Night, Freedom and Empowerment Readings. On that, everyone, take care of yourself. Peace and reparations.